Hello! Today we're going to continue our look at A.K. Warder's Grammar Guide, An Introduction to Pali. And in this tutorial we'll be looking at Lesson 2. If you're new and you don't already have a copy, there's a link to the source text down in the description. And if you've been following and want the answers to Exercise 1 from last week, then check out the Wisdom and Wonders webpage for this chapter, a link to which is also below. This is Pali Studies on the Learn Pali channel. Well, Warder slows down a little in this chapter, so we can too. First, let's get the paragraph irregular stems of the first conjugation out of the way. Here, Warder continues his look at the derivation of the first conjugation class of verbs, where he lists some verbs which belong to the first conjugation but do not follow the regular patterns which he described in Lesson 1, and he calls these irregular stems. The majority of these were actually covered in our look at stem conjugation in last week's tutorial, so for those interested I refer you back there. And with that out of the way, this next section flows better, so let's go back now to the nominative plural. Last week we saw how the subject of the verb is marked by the nominative case. And masculine noun stems in A, like loca, are inflected in the nominative singular to end with o. And if the subject is plural, it will end in along A. And notice the verb also changes to agree with its subject in number 2. Likewise, puriso vedati, the man speaks, and purisa vedanti, the men speak. And importantly, any attribute of the subject will also be in the plural, be it an adjective, a complement, or an apposition. Right, so now we can recap what these terms mean. We can add a quality to the subject noun in various ways. A very common way is with an adjective. In Pali, they normally come before the noun that they qualify, and whereas the substantive will have one specific gender, the adjective term will alter its gender as well as its case and number to match its substantive. And grammatically we can think of the adjective and the substantive as acting as a single unit. A second way to add a quality is with a linking verb or copula, and in Pali this tends to be a form of the verb hoti. The qualifying term is then actually called a complement because it completes the linking verb. It's a necessary argument in order for it to make sense. And technically it's a subject complement as it qualifies the subject. In older grammar guides you may see this called a predicate or a predicating term. Now it's important to note that with a copula, the quality or attribute is technically not an object, and so isn't in the accusative case. Instead, like an adjective, it takes the same case and number as the substantive it qualifies. Finally, there is apposition. This is when two nouns or phrases are grammatically parallel. Either could be the subject, whilst both refer to the same thing. In English these are all slightly different constructions, but in Pali they all tend to result in a string of nouns all in the same case. So if you're faced with a string of several nouns all in the nominative case, these are the potential underlying structures which they can take. And understanding the difference will help us as we now look at the accusative case. As we've already seen, the accusative is generally used to mark the object of the verb, and Warder routinely calls this the patient. And we can see for masculine A-stem nouns, the singular takes the ending ang and the plural e. So with the example, the Brahmin sees the man here is the object, and if we make this plural, we have the Brahmin sees the men. And notice that the verb doesn't change, as it still agrees with the subject, here the Brahmin, which is still singular. Also, if you remember from the last tutorial, if the subject is a pronoun, it's the norm to drop it from the sentence, as it's implied by the verb ending itself. So if we come across a sentence where there is no nominative, then we have to look at the verb for the subject. Okay, let's now dig a little bit deeper into verbs and their objects. A simple sentence or clause can be thought of as a combination of the subject and a verb phrase. All verbs require a subject, even if sometimes in Pali this may be merely implied. But with some verbs there's no object, and verbs that don't require an object in order to make sense are called intransitive. They arrived, I swam, the boy cried, etc. Verbs that take an object are called transitive, because the action is seen to transfer to the object. And in Pali the word order very generally is subject, object, verb. The object of a transitive verb, the one that's required in order for it to make sense, is called a direct object. And in Pali it's this which is placed in accusative case. Some transitive verbs, however, can take two objects. For instance, with the verb to bring in they bring water, we can add a second object. They bring the recluse water. Here the objects are the thing fetched and to whom it was brought. And this second object is called an indirect object and is generally the person or animal that receives the direct object. Now with verbs of bringing and taking in Pali, only occasionally is the indirect object placed in the accusative case. It's much more frequent to use the dative case, and we'll see this in a later lesson. However, verbs of speech, like to call, tell, ask, frequently take two accusative objects in Pali. The direct object being what was said, and the indirect object being to whom. However, remember that any direct speech, like we saw last week, is placed in a T clause. And we can also add qualities to these objects in a similar fashion to the subject. Any attribute of the object will also be placed in the accusative case, such as with an adjective or with a complement where there's an implied linking verb. For instance, I know the recluse to be virtuous. The linking verb is left implied. And here the complement technically is called the object complement because it qualifies the object. And finally, the quality can also be in apposition, where either of two nouns in the accusative could be the object whilst both referring to the same thing. Okay, so far so good. Now there are some other applications of the accusative case. For instance, it's commonly used to express the goal of motion. That is, with verbs that express motion towards something, the terminus, be it a person, place, or even a condition, is placed in the accusative case. This can often appear to be similar to an object, for instance, he enters the village, but more expressly with he goes to the village, where the village is the destination. But the motion can also be figurative or metaphorical. For instance, the influxes come to rest. In fact, this literally reads, the influxes, they go home. Or to take another example, he arrives at destruction. And now we're armed with these concepts, we can take a line from the famous triple gem, Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, which a literal word for word is the Buddha, the refuge, I go to. Here the terms that the Buddha and the refuge are in accusative case, indicating that they are the destination of the verb to go. And these two terms are actually in apposition, so a literal translation in English would be I go to the Buddha, the refuge. And the accusative case is conspicuously adverbial, especially with neuter nouns. So if we look at this line from the Satipatthana Sutra, he knows I breathe out short. The word short here is not an object, but describes the manner of the breathing, and is therefore an adverb. Whereas adjectives add qualities to nouns, adverbs or adverbial phrases add qualities that describe the action or the sentence as a whole. They often add information about the manner, the time, place, frequency, or duration of the event. And I'll list here some common adverbs in Pali. Note, while acting as adverbs, they are in effect indeclinable, and so do not change to agree with anything in the sentence. Well, I think that's as far as I'm going to go with this lesson. Warder gives us a bit more vocabulary to learn, followed by the second exercise. So have a go at the exercises if you like. The answers can be found in the appendix at the end of the guide, and if you want to run through the answers to exercise 1 from last week, there's a link in the description below to the Wisdom and Wonders website, which will walk you through them. And I'll do the same for exercise 2 next week. And of course, in the meantime, there are my other video tutorials, and also my blog.